Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's lecture. My name is Ava Ramirez, and I am a junior at Princeton High School in Princeton, New Jersey. This is the third of 4 online lectures about climate change that I've organized together with my 2 school classmates, Noah and Grace, in conjunction with our AP Environmental Science class taught by Mr. James Smirk. Over the past 2 months, we have featured 2 different speakers who had addressed a set of varied yet inextricably linked issues concerning global warming. Today's lecture will continue discussing issues concerning global warming, but will focus specifically on geosciences and species extinction. Before my classmate Noah introduces today's speaker, I would just like to give you a few technical details about today's event. The lecture will last about 40 minutes, followed by a 20-minute Q&A session. We asked you to please submit your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom center of the Zoom window on your phone or computer screen. The lecture will also be recorded and posted on YouTube for public on-demand viewing in about a week. You will be able to find the link to the recorded lecture on our website. I will post a link to the website in the chat, which has our past lectures, and the link can also be found on our Instagram page, climate_Princeton. We'll now introduce today's speaker. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, it is my great honor to introduce today's speaker, climate scientist Curtis Deutsch, an oceanographer at the High Meadows Environmental Institute at Princeton University, where he is a professor of geosciences. Professor Deutsch graduated from Oberlin College in 1996 with a bachelor's degree in physics, and subsequently received his PhD at Princeton's program in atmospheric and oceanic sciences. He then completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Washington's School of Oceanography prior to teaching atmospheric and oceanic science at UCLA. Throughout his career, Professor Deutsch has received numerous honors, including being named a 2010 Kavli Frontiers of Science Fellow by the National Academy of Sciences, and receiving a 2013 Investigator Award from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. Professor Deutsch's research centers around the relationship between climate change and the ocean, and how the climate crisis impacts marine ecosystems and biogeochemical cycles, specifically the oceanic nitrogen and carbon cycles. The oceans are essential to all life, producing more than half of all the world's oxygen and regulating our climate and weather patterns. More than the Amazon, the oceans are our lungs. But a 2015 report by the World Wildlife Fund found that the number of fish in the oceans has been cut in half since 1970. It is abundantly clear that a better understanding of how our habits affect the oceans is crucial for protecting our planet and our future. Thus, today, Professor Deutsch will be talking about the relationship between climate change and marine species extinction. I know I speak for my co-organizers of this lecture series when I say that we are enormously grateful that he has generously agreed to share some of his research with us. I can imagine you all are as eager as I am to hear what Professor Deutsch has to tell us about this topic. And so, without further ado, I hand him the floor.
Thanks, Noah. That was a very generous introduction. I'd like to thank Noah, Grace, and Ava all for putting together this, this public lecture series. I'm going to share my screen now. Hopefully you can see it. Yes, good. So, and thanks also to all the folks sitting at home, willing to spend a beautiful Saturday evening, assuming you're in our time zone, watching this presentation. What I'm going to do for the next 40 minutes is give you a few glimpses into what we've learned about how climate change affects marine life, with kind of the ultimate endpoint being extinction. So the title is Climate Warming and the Future of Marine Biodiversity. We're going to use elements of Earth's history to inform how we think about what the future might look like, subject, of course, as always, to the choices that we make as humanity about our relationship to the natural world. Okay. So we'll come back to this picture that you're looking at now in various ways over time. It represents a recent study that I did with a graduate student, Justin Penn, to understand one of the largest, or actually the largest, mass extinction in the history of life on Earth. It happened 250 million years ago. We'll come back to this a little bit later. For now, I want to start closer to home with what climate change looks like kind of in a scientific way by the numbers since what might be called the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So going back to 1850 here, let me give myself a laser pointer so that you can see better. Going back to 1850, these are the changes in temperature relative to then. So they start at 0 by definition. Globally averaged for quite some time, temperature was relatively constant. And as you all know by now, it began creeping up in the 20th century. It had a brief period where it sort of stopped rising, and then it really took off in the 1950s. And it's been pretty steadily rising ever since. We know this from all kinds of different information, not just thermometers at the surface of the Earth, but all kinds of properties of the Earth as a system show signs of this warming. Interestingly, one of the major modern tools of science, that is computer models that simulate the components of the Earth system, its momentum and energy budgets, the conservation of mass, of carbon and all kinds of other things, moisture. They actually do a good job of simulating what the Earth has actually done over the past 150 years. And they become indispensable tools for understanding what happened before we had observations, and also what might happen in the future, given certain assumptions about human behaviors. Okay, the other thing that we know from these models is that if the carbon dioxide had not been, the greenhouse gases had not been rising in the atmosphere, the Earth's climate would not have warmed that way. If you simulate the Earth's climate without those, you get the green curve, indicating that without the human addition of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, the Earth's climate would have been relatively constant. Now, these rates of change, something like 1 degree Celsius over the past 50 years, averaged over the surface of the Earth. Those are, it may not sound like a lot. Remember, if you're used to the Fahrenheit scale, you want to multiply by about 2. So that's about 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Globally averaged over 50 years, it doesn't sound like a lot, but it has a lot of potential impacts, and it's also much faster than anything we've seen for many millions of years on Earth. Okay, so there's a view of climate from a kind of scientific point of view, but if you've paid attention to the news at all in the last 10 or 20 years, you'll have heard about climate change in other more visual ways. And here's just a sampling of them. You're likely to hear about the impacts of climate on things that humans more directly experience. Things like storms and wildfires, floods and heat waves and droughts. Those things are all very important for the human experience of climate and weather. You'll notice that they are all also pretty much terrestrial phenomena. That is, they're things that are very tangible to beings that live on land, but they're relative, aside from the melting of ice depicted up here in the corner, most of those elements of climate change that live in the popular awareness in media depictions or images that we carry in our heads of what climate change means, relatively few of them are involve the ocean in a very significant way. We'll come back to that again as we go through this. Makes sense that we would focus on the land because that's where we live. So one of the consequences of that was not depicted in the previous set of images is the impacts on ecosystems. And the most extreme impact you could maybe imagine on an ecosystem is the extinction of a species. And I call that extreme because it's really one of the most irreversible, in fact, maybe the only truly irreversible impacts of change in an ecosystem. Notwithstanding some of the ideas from certain technologists about bringing back extinct animals, we can pretty much say that when an animal is gone to the very last member, a species is gone, it's it's extinct, that's a pretty irreversible change. So it draws attention sort of philosophically to a very profound impact that humans could have on the natural world. And in fact, this graph shows that we are already having that impact on the natural world since the early colonial period in the 1500s, all the way up through today. The extinction of animals has grown exponentially. And you'll see here that it's broken down into a number of curves. There are mammals and birds up here, other vertebrates down here, and vertebrates as a whole are kind of the average of those two. They have to fall somewhere in between. This background line here represents what people estimate to be the natural rate of species extinction. And somewhere around depending on which group you look at, somewhere early in the development of human agricultural societies to industrial societies, we caused a rate of extinction that has exceeded that background rate. You'll notice also here that almost all of these, well, they're all cartoon images of actual species, but with one exception, this fish down here, they're virtually all terrestrial animals again. So it appears that the extinction rates being elevated by human activity is also another very land-focused phenomenon. And that also makes sense, of course, as people who have, as a species that has been hunting and fishing things to extinction, it makes sense that most of those extinctions have happened on land. Now, most of these extinctions too are, or in fact, possibly all of them, were not caused by climate change. So these were, extinctions, animals driven to extinction by the loss of the destruction of habitats, but really primarily by direct hunting to the very last member of the species. So I'm putting together two things here. One is the human impact on climate. The other is the human impact on ecosystems through the extinction of species. And now I'm trying to point out that those two things are almost non-overlapping. That is to say, the climate has not really been the major factor in driving extinction of animal species, but we could ask, could it have been in the past and could it be again in the future if climate continues to accelerate in its pace? So that's another very scientific look at extinction. Here's a much more familiar kind of look at what how extinction might live in your mind before you came to this talk. It's a certain set of pretty household name charismatic species: passenger pigeon, the dodo, most recently the golden toad, an amphibian from Costa Rica, which was the first known instance of a suspected climatic effect on a species extinction. You'll notice that these again are all terrestrial species, but with the exception of the toad, they're all again driven by the extinction was driven by non-climatic factors. So it raises the question, well, what about marine species that are missing from this list? In fact, we don't know of any marine species that's gone extinct through human impacts. And we don't know of any in the ocean that, and we know very few anywhere, in fact, none for certain, that has been driven to extinction by climate, even on land. The golden toad being the one possible exception. Okay. So we're going to talk about the interaction of multiple extinction is a process that can be driven by multiple interacting influences. So I want to think here about how climate kind of combines with other stresses that ecosystems might face. And I want to think of this as a metaphor, the ripples on this water surface as a metaphor for how disturbance propagates through a natural system. You can imagine throwing a stone on the surface of a pond, and you can easily you have experience to tell you how the ripples form right at the point where where the stone hits the surface. That might be a disturbance in the climate caused by, for example, greenhouse gas emissions. And the disturbance kind of moves outward from the locus of that initial stone, let's say, and it causes ripples to expand on the surface of the pond. And as you move out, the the circles of that, the number of locations that can feel that disturbance grows, but they tend to be nearby. They're relatively direct effects of the stone causing the waves to, bob the water up and down. As you move further out, you can start to imagine less direct influence. You're further away from the initial point of disturbance, and the indirect effects can become more complex, and they can also become more uncertain. And you can maybe see why this is a good metaphor for how the Earth is responding to our climate disturbance in the ocean. And the same is true really for other direct, influences on a complex system, where we're also perturbing the ocean in other ways. So for example, hunting and fishing, or terrestrial ecosystems as well, land use, all these things create their own separate trains of waves that emanate. And the interesting point is that right in the middle of these two different stones thrown in the pond, you've got this wave pattern that can be extremely complex. It can also be quite vigorous, because you have two waves that can add together and make a larger wave. So the interactions of these different disturbances can be incredibly difficult to understand. And that's maybe even more true in the ocean than it is on land, because in the ocean we have vast expanses where we have very few observations. So it's very hard to understand something that you can't see and don't have historical records of. So the question is, how are we going to try to understand species in the ocean, given that it lies at the kind of intersection of where direct human disturbance and then indirect disturbance through the climate system might be interacting in major biomes of the Earth where we have limited observations. Okay, so just a couple of things about the ocean that you probably have heard before, but it's 70% of the Earth's surface, partly why it's so sparsely observed. It accounts for 50% of the global photosynthesis, just as Noah mentioned about oxygen, and about 20% of global human dietary protein intake. So far, the ocean has absorbed about half of the fossil fuel CO2 that we've emitted from the burning of coal, oil, and gas. And it's absorbed more than 90% of all the thermal energy that the climate has absorbed, leading to the warming that we see. And yet we know relatively little about the impacts of all those things on the marine biosphere. Okay, so how are we going to make progress? First of all, let me point out that the stone that I'm going to focus on, really being thrown onto the surface of this water, is the carbon dioxide that we're emitting into the atmosphere. That carbon dioxide has some that inner circle of direct effects. It changes the temperatures of the surface climate, as I've shown you before. It also changes the acidity of water, because carbon dioxide added to water makes an acid. And it can also alter the winds in the atmosphere that force the ocean to move, the sea surface currents. As we get further away from those direct impacts, it has more indirect impacts on the amount of oxygen that's in the ocean, the amount of nutrients in the ocean, the amount of light, how deep light might penetrate into the surface of the ocean. And of course, those things, light, nutrients, and oxygen, are key ingredients for the living things in the ocean. That includes plants, animals, bacteria. What's commonly referred to, or one common way to refer to all these impacts on the ocean, is that it's heating up, it's turning sour, and it's losing breath. And the first one is obvious. The ocean is warming. The latter two might not be so obvious. Turning sour refers to the effect of the increasing acidity of the ocean, which has an impact on plants and animals. And the losing breath refers to the effect of CO2 indirectly on animals through the loss of oxygen from the ocean, sometimes called hypoxia. I'm really going to focus on these two elements that this arrow passes through, the change in temperature and the change in oxygen on animals, because our recent work in my group has shown that has a huge impact on the likelihood of species extinction. We're going to do that by turning to the past, because all the climate changes that you see here, from changes in the CO2 of the atmosphere, have happened before on Earth. The Earth's been around a long time, and so have animals in the ocean and on land. And CO2 has gone up and down in the atmosphere, not by human intervention, but by, for example, volcanic eruptions that release large amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere. So there are periods of Earth history where major climate shifts have happened, and the biosphere has had to respond to those. And we might be able to use those to understand what might happen in the future. So here's a sort of the history of Earth's biosphere in one simple slide. There are lots of different versions of this. Some of it might be familiar to you. This goes back to the Cambrian explosion, when there was a massive diversification of life forms on Earth about 500 to 600 million years ago, about a little over 500 million years. Still, you know, a small fraction of the Earth's 4.5 billion year history. Before that, there were really no large-bodied animals anywhere. They took off in their diversity. This is the number of families. The Cambrian explosion just refers not to an explosion literally, but to the rapid growth in the diversity of animal species on Earth. And basically that diversity has continued to be high. In fact, it's grown even since the Cambrian explosion. We're at a relative high point in the diversity of life forms on Earth. But you can see that that growth of diversity has not been very steady. It's been punctuated by periods in particular of rapid declines in diversity. And there are about 5 of those that are recognized as truly geologically significant events in the history of the Earth, in which diversity was cut by a substantial margin. The biggest of those was at the end of the Permian period. That's 252 million years ago, when the diversity of families was cut by about half. Number of species went down even more. In the ocean, about 90% of all species went extinct at the end of the Permian. So these 5 big mass extinctions offer all kinds of interesting and useful lessons for what happens when a major change is when the Earth undergoes a major change and the biosphere has to respond in some way. The Permian tends to be of special interest for a couple of reasons. One, because it was so big, and another because it actually is characterized in the geologic record by many of the same changes that we're seeing today. That is, the increased acidity of the ocean, the increased temperatures of the ocean, the decreased amount of oxygen in the ocean, and all of those things were happening in the same direction and probably at around the same time, but in a much more extreme way. So if we can learn what happens in the extreme case, we might be able to say something about what happens in the future when hopefully it's not quite so extreme. Another important thing about these extinctions in the geologic record is that, unlike today, where the ocean is very poorly represented in the data we have, back then the ocean is very well represented. That's because the fossils that can be made in sedimentary rock and preserved in rock for millions of years carry a lot of marine species. So we actually know relatively a lot about what happened in the ocean during those past periods, ironically. So let me go back to some basic kind of science from elementary school, perhaps for some of you. And it's aimed to get at the importance of how climate warming impacts the amount of oxygen in the ocean. So one thing we know is that although the ocean appears to be a liquid and the atmosphere appears to be a gas, the separation is not completely strict. That is, that the atmosphere also holds gaseous phases of water, right? It holds liquid, and you see that most obviously in the form of clouds, which happens when the air is cooled and the liquid vapor in air condenses to form liquid droplets. So it turns back in phase from a gas back into a liquid, and you get that by cooling the water down. So that's a very familiar form of a phase transition in the atmosphere. The one that I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about is the opposite. It's where a gas that's dissolved in a liquid turns back into droplets of gas. So that can be, you may have experience with that when you heat water on the stove. So this is just a pot of water that's been heated up to not quite boiling, but a hot temperature. And you start to see little air bubbles. The surface, they nucleate at the surface of the pot, and eventually they'll start to rise up and out of the water. Now that's a very dramatic example of how the gas comes out of solution and will ultimately go back into the air above. But it's the same basic thing that happens when you warm up the gas by a small amount. It's just that you don't see it because the gas doesn't form bubbles, but it still begins to, the individual gas molecules start to come out of the liquid and go back into the air. Okay, so turns out this is true for any gas, but the gas that we're going to be interested in today is the one that we're all breathing, which is oxygen. It's also the gas that all the marine life in the ocean has to breathe, as long as they're not a mammal. That tends to be relatively scarce in the ocean to begin with. And so if it gets more scarce, you can imagine that, that things could have a harder time breathing underwater than they do already. But first, let's see what happens when the ocean warms. Test this idea that the heated pot releases its gas bubbles. Let's see if the ocean does the same. So here's an image showing over time, over the past half century or more, the change in the global heat content. So you've seen something like this for the surface air, an earlier figure, just showing that yes, indeed, the ocean has warmed up. This is in an extremely strange unit of 10 to the 22nd power of joules, and joules is just a scientific unit for energy. So the thermal energy of the ocean has been increasing. That is, the average temperature has been going up. What do we know about the change of oxygen content of the ocean over that same time period? Well, that's shown here. So now the global amount of heat is put on the x-axis, not the y-axis as it was over here. And on the y-axis, we've instead replaced the total inventory of oxygen in 10 to the 14th moles. So that's another common scientific unit for the amount of some chemical. It doesn't matter so much what the unit is. The point is that if you follow the points, which are all estimates of the global inventory of oxygen every month since we could begin making these observations back in the 1950s or so, the months with higher global heat have also had a lower global inventory of oxygen. So indeed, the ocean is behaving much like that pot of heated water on the stove. We just don't see it as bubbles coming out. We have to make millions of measurements to actually see the loss of oxygen. Fortunately, people have been doing that for many decades, many thousands of people. This is making a figure like this takes countless hours of scientific, relies on countless efforts of scientific effort. Okay, so let's go back to organisms for a second and think about what that loss of oxygen might mean. If you remember back into the deep recesses of your scientific educations, you'll remember that oxygen is the source of energy. Oxygen and glucose are the source of energy for respiration that keeps animals alive. The chemical reaction, glucose plus oxygen, releasing carbon dioxide and water, but also the energy in the form of ATP that is used to fuel all the biochemical reactions in our bodies and those of all other animals. It turns out that the energy then needs oxygen and food, sugars in food, to fuel it, and the rate of that reaction will increase as temperatures go up. So if I can get this to play, perhaps. Just a little animation to illustrate why that happens. The warmer condition is associated with more vibration of molecules, more collisions among molecules, and therefore more reactions of molecules. The number of times a molecule collides is just shown down here, counting up over time. You can see that under the warmer water, the frequency of those molecules colliding is going to be much greater, and the rate of reaction will be greater. It's a basic principle of physical chemistry, but it also regulates biochemistry in the bodies of animals. So as temperatures go up, that rate of energy conversion is going to go up, and that means that the supply of oxygen will need to go up to keep pace with those reactions. So we can see that across the animal kingdom. It's almost a universal law that as you increase temperature, the rate of metabolism, the collection of all those biochemical reactions, speeds up. And actually, these are measured as the rate at which oxygen gets taken out of air or water in the case of terrestrial and marine species. So for terrestrial species, that rate of oxygen consumption clearly rises, and rather dramatically rises, as temperatures go up. This is a log scale. So one unit on this scale is a 10-fold change in the rate of oxygen consumption. A very similar phenomenon is true for marine species. As temperatures go up, their requirement for their demand for oxygen goes up. Now, it turns out that the key difference here between terrestrial and marine species, which is not visible in this plot, but I'll just tell you, is that marine species are already facing relatively low amounts of oxygen in their environment, whereas terrestrial species breathing oxygen in air, like us, will almost never experience limitation by oxygen unless we go to some very high altitude location. Marine species are facing the potential for limitation of their metabolism by oxygen on a routine basis. Okay, so how are we going to use this to understand extinction? Well, so here's a kind of cartoon picture where we've got temperature here on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we've got a measure of how much oxygen it takes to keep your metabolism going. If you don't get enough oxygen, you can't metabolize, and eventually you will die. So we've got a line here that denotes what I'm going to call a tolerance limit. That is, for any combination of oxygen in your environment and temperature in your environment, if you're above that limit, then the conditions in the environment are inhabitable. You can survive there. If the conditions are below that line, either they're too warm or they're too low in oxygen, that condition would be uninhabitable. So you can imagine that if you start above the line, like let's suppose you start in a place that has this temperature and this oxygen, you could cross below the line by either warming up. Oops, let me go back to a laser pointer. Starting here, you could either cross below the line simply by warming up, moving in this direction. Now you're below the line. Or you could do the same thing by moving down in oxygen, by losing oxygen and going below the line in that way. Okay. What this figure is meant to represent is that now we can think about both changes in the environment and the nature of species physiologies together in one picture. And we're going to do that using this quantity called a metabolic index. Physiologically, it's just the ratio of how much oxygen an organism could get from their environment relative to what they actually need. Graphically, and that may be most useful for most of you, it's really just the metabolic index is just the height above the line or below the line. So if you're above the line, high above the line, you have plenty of oxygen for the temperature you live at, and you're going to do just fine. If you're below the line, you're going to be in a place that's not habitable for very long at all. Mathematically, for those who like math, you can write this as a simple algebraic equation. It involves the temperature of the environment, the oxygen in the environment, the temperature in the environment, and two properties that describe an organism. One is sort of the height of this line, with you can imagine sliding it up and making something more easily limited by oxygen, or pushing the whole line down to make an organism more tolerant to low oxygen. You could also imagine making the line curve more steeply. That would make it more temperature sensitive, easier to cross the line by warming up. Or you could make the line flatter. In fact, if you made it perfectly flat, then it's not going to care what the temperature is. Okay, so we're going to think about, we're going to use this quantity to understand the dynamics of extinction in the ocean. All right, so here's just one example of famous species, one of the favorite species of North Americans and Europeans, because it's been used for so long to sustain fisheries and human diets. It's the Atlantic cod, and of course it's found along the eastern coast of North America, the western coast of Europe, but it has a particular, the blue dots represent all the places where it's found in the world today. And those blue dots basically have a boundary, and you can follow the boundary of the blue dots with your eye, but the boundary coincides with a particular value of this habitability index, this metabolic index. And we don't need to worry about what the particular value is. It just serves to illustrate that the places where cod can live and can't live in the ocean can be predicted once we know the temperature of the water, the oxygen of the water, and what those species traits are that describe how high the line is and how steep that line is. Okay. It turns out that on a seasonal basis, these populations also migrate north and south with latitude, or from shallow to deep ocean, also in accordance with this property of the water that they live in, its habitability index or the metabolic index. Okay, so with that now, just one example, the Atlantic cod, we can expand to as many species as we can find. And here we're standing on the shoulders of giants who have measured the tolerances to oxygen and temperature for dozens of species over many decades that cover the whole ocean, basically, from the equator to the pole, all three major ocean basins, all the depths of the ocean, a whole wide variety of taxonomic groups, from things like corals, which of course are animals, up to fish and crustaceans, mollusks. We have a wide diversity of species where we can actually define the curve, that tolerance curve, that habitability curve. And that means we can use this to understand how diversity is impacted by global changes. Okay, so we're going to do that by first noting that some species are going to be vulnerable to change and some are going to be more resilient. So a vulnerable species on the left might be one that has a very steep tolerance curve, or one that's very high, requires very high oxygen on average. Either one of those qualities will make it more vulnerable to a change in the climate. Some species might be more resilient. Either they have a very weak slope so that they're not so worried about temperature change, or the curve overall lies very low so that they can inhabit waters that have low oxygen. That would be a more resilient species. But of course, whether a population or a species is vulnerable or resilient in the face of change also depends on where they live and how much change is visited upon that region. So you could have a region that warms a lot and loses a lot of oxygen, or you could have a region that warms not quite so much, maybe doesn't lose quite as much oxygen. So you can be resilient or vulnerable to climate change either because the intrinsic physiological nature of your species, or because of the part of the ocean that you live in and how climate change impacts that part. So now we can use this to understand the past extinction before returning to the future. And here we're going to draw on those incredible tools of modern science, the computational models that simulate the Earth system. Justin Penn, my collaborator in this work, did these simulations on a giant supercomputer. It took many months to simulate. He first of all moved the continents around and introduced a rapid volcanic input of CO2 into the atmosphere, and let the Earth system respond to that in the way that our understood rules of Earth systems are characterized in that model. And what you see here is just the warming up of the ocean. So the ocean got warmer. It got warmer, especially in the upper layers, less so in the lower layers. There's still, the poles are still cooler than the tropics. That's always true. That's just a function of where the sun is. And the magnitude of that warming is, in this model simulation, actually reproduces what other workers have seen in the chemical composition of fossils. So the chemistry of fossils can be a way to estimate how much temperature change happened over periods of the Earth past. And what you see here across from the Permian to the Triassic was a rapid increase in the temperature that's recorded in those fossils. And the model simulation, which is the red points, it reproduces the magnitude of that change. So now we can just ask, from the Permian to the Triassic, among that whole diversity among the full diversity of possible species traits, that is those tolerance curves, the high ones and the low ones, the steep ones and the shallow ones, which ones would have survived this amount of warming and the oxygen loss that's associated with it, and which ones might have perished. So one simple way of doing that is to look at how much volume of their initial habitat they would have lost. Okay, so here we're looking at a wide range of temperature sensitivities. So this is the slope, the steepness of that tolerance curve. And here we're looking at the oxygen sensitivity, the height of that curve, whether it sits high or low on the oxygen scale. And each of these points represents a type of species that we see in the modern ocean. What you see is that for very many types of species, the loss of habitat going from the Permian to the Triassic, that rapid climate change that happened 250 million years ago, they would have lost virtually 100% of their habitat. That is, their tolerance curve was such that nowhere in their original habitat could they have remained and had enough energy to metabolize. So every dot in this represents a species that would have certainly gone extinct. If you lose 100% of the viable habitat in the ocean, you are guaranteed to go extinct. That means you can't survive anywhere. There are a lot of species that lose less habitat, still a lot, over half of their habitat, but they might have been able to survive under if they could survive on a small fraction of their initial habitat, they might have been able to squeak through and not go extinct. If you get to, some species might have even gained habitat, but that's a very small range of traits that would allow a species to actually gain habitat under such an extreme climate scenario. Okay, so now we can ask, well, given these all would have gone extinct, what fraction of these might have gone extinct, and where would they have lived? It turns out the model makes a very simple prediction. It says that if you look at where the species are that would have gone extinct and where the ones that would have less likely gone extinct, you get a very characteristic pattern, which is that the species that started off living in the high latitudes near the pole, so here's the North Pole, the South Pole, the species that start off living at the poles in the cold climates, they went extinct. They must have gone extinct by the largest margin. So 60 to 80% of those species would have gone extinct. If you move to the tropical ocean that's already warmest, you find that those species also went extinct pretty frequently, but a little bit less, about 20% less likely to go extinct for species that started off living in warmer waters. And maybe that's surprising to some of you. Think about the tropical oceans and tropical lands being the warmest already. If they get warmer, you might think that the susceptibility to extinction would be highest there. But it turns out that, if things can move, they can find those conditions that they used to inhabit. They just have to move toward higher latitudes. It's the things that already live in the coldest waters that are the most at risk of extinction, because that's where, if you're only accustomed to living in cold waters and there are no more cold waters once the Earth warms up, you have nowhere that exhibits the conditions that you can tolerate. And so it's really the polar ocean where the species go the most extinct. So this was kind of an interesting prediction of the model, but we didn't know if it was actually true in nature. So we took this result to colleagues who study the fossil record at Stanford University, and they dug through all the fossils that have ever been compiled for the Permo-Triassic extinction event, and they just calculated what fraction of tropical species went extinct and what fraction of higher latitude species went extinct. And at every latitude where they could make that calculation, they put the dot on the graph, and you see that it conforms very closely to what the model predicted. That is, that everywhere species went extinct by high percentages, but they went extinct more frequently in the higher latitudes and slightly less frequently in the low latitudes. So what we learned from this is that that combination of the warming ocean and the loss of oxygen from the ocean appears to be a mechanism that can explain the geographic pattern of extinction during this really important extinction event in Earth history. Now, you could ask whether there are other possible changes that would have produced that exact same pattern, and we did ask this question. And the answer is basically no. All of the other changes that happen, from the reduced productivity of the ocean to the increased acidity of the ocean, they actually produce patterns of extinction that go the opposite direction, with more extinction at high latitudes than with more extinction at low latitudes than in high latitudes. So that reinforces the sense that this combination, this very fundamental need for enough oxygen to fuel your metabolism, is a key driver of ocean extinction. So with that, now we can turn back to the future. And in the last several minutes here, I'm just going to tell you what insights we get from looking into the past about what the future could look like. And I want to preface it by saying that the future is not yet written, of course. It involves choices by very many people and and institutions with a lot of power to decide whether we follow a course of the future that looks like this blue curve, where carbon dioxide, which is currently a little bit over 400 parts per million in the atmosphere, begins to level off early and reach a relatively low level of something like 450 parts per million, maybe, or whether we continue kind of on a course that we've been on, which is more like the red curve, in which case we would end up with an end of the century atmosphere that's got above 900 parts per million of CO2. So it's important to recognize that as we think about the future, we could end up on either one of these paths or anything in between, and maybe even something outside of that range. But this range basically covers most of what people think is plausible, given how much oil there is in the ground and how slowly we've been acting to keep it there. Okay. So here's what the exact same kinds of simulations that we did for the Permian look like as we move into the future. So this is not extinction, but it's a close relative. It's called extirpation. It's just the number of species that goes locally extinct. So if you think about going swimming off the New Jersey shore and counting up the number of species that you see, that could be a lower number than you see in the future. Some of the species that are there now might not be there in the future. That doesn't mean that they went globally extinct. It does mean that they went locally extinct, and we're going to refer to that as extirpation. But you can take an average across the whole globe of what fraction of species locally disappeared. And that extirpation number is shown in these curves versus latitude. So what you see is that local loss of species begins rather early. So already by 2020, given historical warming, we would predict that there have been species that have been kicked out of their historical habitat by the fact that the ocean has gotten warmer and less oxygenated. And in fact, when people go to the historical record and look for where species live, they do indeed find that there are places where species used to be that they are no longer. So the idea that there are already in 2022 extirpations of species, local extinctions, is a reasonable prediction of the model. As you move forward in time, of course, those extirpations get more and more pronounced. The magnitude depends on whether you follow a high emissions in the warmer colors or a low emissions in the blue. If you stay in low emissions, those extirpations might double. If you go to high emissions by the end of the century, they more than double. If you follow the high emissions out to 2300, 2.5, 3 centuries from now, you can get extirpations that, in the lower latitudes mean more than half of the species there now will no longer be there in the future. That doesn't mean they went extinct, but it means locally you won't find them anymore. They've had to either move on. Some of them might have gone extinct. The importance for this latitudinal pattern, the high rates of species evacuation from the tropical latitudes, is partly concerning because that's where the highest richness of species is. Of course, in the warm tropical oceans, you find many more species than in the cold polar oceans. So the evacuation of those species from those rich, biologically rich environments. Think about coral reefs or other tropical habitats in the ocean. They're going to be hit the hardest by local species extinctions. Now that contrasts with what I told you about global extinctions, which were stronger in the high latitudes. Okay, we'll come back to that in a moment. But that extirpation, that fractional loss of species locally, once you average over the whole globe, depends very strongly on how much warming happens. And it depends on it in about a linear fashion. Okay, so here we are on the black curve. Well, we started at 0 back in 1850. 0 warming relative to 1850 and no extirpations. We've already come to about here. That is that 1 or so degree of warming that the ocean has already undergone. And there's probably been several percent of extirpations that have already happened as a result of that. Now, if we follow the low emissions trajectory, this blue one, which involves reducing fossil fuel emissions pretty much now and fairly dramatically, if we follow that low emissions, we can prevent much more warming. Warming will continue for some time because the climate system has inertia, and it's like a flywheel that's not going to stop warming immediately, but it will warm in such a way as to prevent really large extirpations. If we follow the high emissions scenario out to end of this century here, these kinds of warmings, 4, 5, 6, maybe even higher temperatures, global average, or out to a couple more centuries, out to 2300, then we can start to see warmings that exceed 5 degrees, even exceed 10 degrees. And now we're getting into the range where extirpations start to rival what we would get for the Permian. Okay. Of course, there's a lot of uncertainty about, number one, whether we follow a low emissions scenario or a high emissions scenario. That's a human choice. There's also still substantial uncertainty about whether the climate system under a given emissions warms up by a lot or by less than a lot. The other thing you can see here is that as we move forward, we start the climate effect on species persistence or species extirpation begins to exceed what people estimate to be the direct threats to marine ecosystems from other non-climate related sources, things like overfishing, direct habitat destruction by things like seafloor trawling, pollution, transport, other forms of direct threats to human species get exceeded by the climate threat at some point in the future under high emissions. Now we can think about extinction, and this again involves knowing what fraction of the overall volume of habitat is needed to be retained in order for a species to remain viable. And here we have to distinguish between those species that are kind of stuck in place. They can't move to exploit new habitat. So think about species on the seafloor that might be more sessile and rooted to a particular place or needing a particular substrate to grow. Those ones that will have very poor rates of colonization of new habitat will go extinct much faster. Those that can exploit new habitat and move toward the poles and follow their preferred environmental conditions as those conditions move poleward toward the colder parts of the ocean, they will undergo extinction more slowly. But eventually, if the Earth warms, beyond 10 degrees, they really also start to go extinct at high rates. Hopefully we're staying down in this little is a zoom in here on the low end of the temperature scale. If we keep emissions low, you can see that the blue curves, they stay below the extinctions that we might expect from other threats. They also stay below the lines here, which are the big 5 mass extinctions. So on this figure here, we've got the 5 gray lines are the big 5 mass extinctions, the Permian on the top, the late Devonian on the bottom. If warming continues though, beyond 5 degrees, in fact, even by the end of this century under a high, if climate warms on the high range of what model projections show, we get into a world where we're in the realm of extinctions that rival what's been seen in the geologic record of the big five from the Earth's past. So the key takeaway here is that if we allow warming to continue at rates that don't curtail emissions, then we're on the red path. And if we're on the red path, we're looking at within this century, possibly, and certainly within a few centuries from now, we're looking at oceans that are losing species on a permanent global basis at rates that are comparable to the most extreme situations that have been seen in the fossil record. That's the bad news. The good news is if we follow a low emissions trajectory, that is if we pretty much act now to start really ramping down fossil fuel emissions, then we follow the blue curve, and we would still get some extinction, especially for those sessile organisms that can't move so well. The dash curve is sort of 50% sessile and 50% very mobile species. We would still avoid a mass extinction, or we would still experience some extinction in the ocean, but we would keep that to a minimum. That is, it wouldn't register as a geologic event in the same way that a high emission scenario would. And in particular, if you want to put a number on it, the extinction rate under a low emission scenario was reduced by more than 70%. So that's a pretty big avoidance of harm if we can figure out how to move toward a low carbon energy system that reduces the emissions of fossil fuels. Okay, so I'm going to come back to the beginning and the history of diversity of the biosphere. This is a figure like the one you saw before, except now we're just looking at the marine biological richness. This is the fraction of current species of current richness that has been observed over the past 500 million years. Of course, it started with virtually zero species richness of animal taxa, and it reaches 1 at the present day. And it's been growing with these punctuated periods of extinction in between. And now we can put the future on the same graph and see what it looks like. And of course, we want to keep in mind that there are lots of different futures. The blue one, again, is the one that involves us turning the corner on CO2 emissions, on fossil fuel burning, and really reducing those emissions. And it results in a relatively small loss of diversity from the ocean. If, however, we don't do that and we continue on the course that we've been on, emitting fossil fuels at high rates, we follow this red curve. And on this geologic timescale, you're looking at changes in biological species diversity that really send the Earth back something like 50 million years to a level of diversity that hasn't been seen on Earth in a very, very, very long time. So, of course, that's up to, this is the difference between the blue curve and the red curve is entirely a human decision. It's a decision for societies worldwide to make, particularly those that emit the most fossil fuels. And it's one that therefore we have some agency in affecting, especially in wealthy countries like the United States. Okay, so let me just give you a couple take-home messages. The continued acceleration of climate warming, it does threaten the ocean with a 6th mass extinction. That's the bad news. The good news is it can still be avoided if we can follow a low emissions future. And that means that really, from the point of view of the richness of life in the ocean, solving the climate problem really is essential. At the same time, as I've said, there's multiple ripples on the pond, and we are threatening marine species diversity with other things that are not climate related: over harvesting, habitat destruction, pollution, and transport that also need to be addressed. And there are lots of investments ongoing in marine conservation, in illustrating that we are committed to actually reducing those impacts. But so solving the climate problem is essential, but it's also not enough. And with that, let me just point out that you're part of other ripples that are taking place to propagate an understanding and an awareness of this problem that the oceans face, which ultimately, hopefully, will change the choices that we make about preserving the diversity of the ocean. And with that, I'll just thank you and welcome any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Professor Deutsch, for such an inspiring and captivating lecture. So now we will move into the Q&A. There are lots of questions already. I would like to start by asking some questions of my own. I have lots of questions, but I'll control myself. So a first question I have is, environmental issues have always interested me. And as I researched different problems, I learned about the interconnectedness between many of these issues. For instance, deforestation emits carbon into the atmosphere while simultaneously reducing the carbon sequestered by forests, which increases acidification in the ocean. And additionally, studies such as the Oxford University Poor and Nemesek study and a 2021 Chatham House report show that eating animals is the main cause of this deforestation, and a vegan world would reduce agricultural land by 75%, essentially ending deforestation and freeing up land the size of Africa, which could be used to regrow forests to sequester more carbon and reduce ocean acidification. And furthermore, the 2021 IPCC report states that a vegan diet is the diet with the greatest greenhouse gas mitigation potential. And so given this information, some people suggest that a vegan diet is a responsible way to help marine ecosystems. I would like to know what you think about that.
All that I believe is true. I think it probably preserves terrestrial ecosystems first and foremost, but you're right, ultimately everything is connected. I think, that eating low on the food chain is at this point where, the human population has so dominated ecosystem services of many types is a pretty is a kind of win-win strategy in many ways. There are just so many benefits of reducing consumption of animal products. And of course, I would say that people who, it's also not it's not an easy choice for people. For many people, it's a difficult choice. But it's also one that is not, whose impact isn't binary, right? It's not an either it's not an on or off switch. Anything that, any reduction in the trophic level that your diet consists of has a beneficial impact on terrestrial ecosystems, on the climate. Yeah.
Thank you. That was a very insightful response. I have another question focusing more on marine species. So according to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, the 34% of the world's fisheries are overfished and 60% are fished to their maximum sustainable level. The ocean is at its limit, which strongly suggests that we cannot sustainably produce enough seafood to feed a growing human population in the upcoming decades. And additionally, fishing is a serious issue to marine species, such as by killing over 650,000 dolphins, whales, and turtles through bycatch every year per the NRDC. And the US Marine Mammal Commission states that bycatch is the greatest direct cause of marine mammal death globally. And so given this information, do you think that for populations that do not depend on seafood, such as Western countries, not eating seafood is an effective way to help marine ecosystems directly?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, all the statistics you cite, I think, are consistent with my understanding. I think that there are so many aspects of commercial fishing that are just inordinately destructive of marine environments. I mean, among the worst of them is the seafloor trawling, and there are efforts afoot to promote international agreements to ban seafloor trawling. I know that Costa Rica is their environmental ministry is pushing for a global, or at least an international agreement, if not everywhere, at least as many countries as possible, to join a ban on seafloor trawling. And that's a huge source of not only habitat destruction, I mean, not only bycatch, but habitat destruction. It's not just the animals that are destroyed as these trawls go over the sea floor that weren't intended to be killed, but the entire structure of the habitat that gets just destroyed. So it's an incredibly destructive practice, and certainly, I would start with the things that are, as with anything, start with the most destructive and work on those first, and work your way down to the down the list in a prioritized fashion. There are places that in the world, and especially in the global south, that where fishing has been a source of sustenance for hundreds of years, if not longer, and that probably do still rely on that. But as you say, there are also countries that can live without it and find other sources of protein, and places that should look to do that as much as possible.
Thank you for that answer. Thank you. Really. We have some other questions here. So someone asked, what is the #1 action to prevent ocean warming and stop, or at least slow down, both extirpation and extinction?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Noah has hit on one of them. That is, our agricultural system is associated with enormous greenhouse gas emissions. And people, and the other one is transportation. We are particularly in the United States way behind where we could be on systems of transportation that are far less carbon intensive, and that's true at large scales and at small scales. I mean, there's a role for regional cooperation in light rail and local municipalities to promote public transit in ways that would be just beneficial in across the board. Of course, there's also a role for individual choices to make improvements on that too. And those two things tend to have, they interact with one another. The more people, the more municipalities build good light rail and bike lanes, the more people will use it. And the more people will use it, the more they'll demand those things from their local and state governments. So transportation is another huge area. I would say, the agricultural system and diet as the personal manifestation of that, and then transportation systems and the personal manifestations of those are both huge areas where a person can, both individually and through advocacy and education, have a huge impact on emissions. There are other areas that are also, I mean, there are other areas where you can have an impact. Some of them are a little bit harder. You can switch your fuel sources for residential heating, for example, solar panels, all the things that most people at this talk will probably have heard of. Some of those they might require higher capital investment or longer range planning, and you don't always have control over those, right? I mean, someone renting a house doesn't decide what the fuel source for winter heating is, or where their electricity comes from, for example. Whereas those other transportation and agricultural diet issues are things that are more accessible to more people, I would say. But yeah, there are, I should have included a slide on, further resources. I would check out Union of Concerned Scientists. They have a great web page for resources on questions like this that go well beyond anything I can describe on short notice.
Thank you once again for a very in-depth answer, Professor Deutsch. We have another question here. Your slide on the deep history of extinction indicates the striking increase in the number of species and families over this vast temporal period.
Mm-hmm.
Would it thus be fair to say that since we have dramatically more species on Earth today compared to the distant past, then a dramatic increase in extinction rates, as indicated by the graph, would nevertheless still leave the Earth with comparatively more species than there used to be? If so, are we overreacting to the very real fact of species extinction?
Yeah, that's a good question. So let me get rid of this chat window here. I think you're referring to this, maybe this figure here. The question is absolutely right, that if even under the most pessimistic scenario, let's say, where extinctions reach kind of end Permian levels, or at least big 5 levels, we aren't going back to the Precambrian where there's no animal diversity, right? Where you can just draw the line from here straight across. We're reducing diversity by something like 30%, but it's it's still higher diversity than the Earth, than the oceans probably had for most of its history over the last 500 million years. It's also still true. I mean, it's sort of a glass half empty, glass half full sort of thing, right? You can always, even if we were to knock out 90% of the species of the ocean, we'd still have more diversity than the Precambrian ocean had. So it's sort of a, yes, for sure, you can say there's still going to be relative to Earth history, there will still be a diverse biota of the ocean, even with a mass extinction. I hope I understood the question right.
That answered it. I think that was really good. There's another question. Do you believe that it is still possible to be hopeful?
Yeah, I do. I mean, yeah, just in the last, I don't know, 10 years, I think we've seen way more investment in renewable energies than people expected, or at least maybe than I expected. I mean, solar and wind have become far more competitive energy technologies to fossil fuels than they were. So, and I think that the growth in that is has not leveled off yet. I don't know how to predict the future, but I see that as one key sign of hope. I mean, I think there's, also good reasons to balance that hope with a lot of realistic angst. I mean, I don't want people to be, I don't think that losing hope is really healthy or constructive. There's that too. There's both good reasons to have it, like realism. There's realistic reasons to have hope, but there's also just the necessity to have it. I think you just can't, at least for me, I just can't not have it, because it's just not a healthy way to live. That's a very personal response, but hope is a personal thing. It's not a scientific thing. So I'm giving you a very unscientific response.
I agree. I think there needs to be a combination between hope and like worry to galvanize people into action that will actually help stop or prevent a certain amount of warming in the future. I have some more questions. So this lecture was mostly focused on the temperature and oxygen tolerance, which was extremely interesting. Most of when I learned about ocean, marine species, and ecosystems and climate change, it was all focused on ocean acidification. And I learned that, it has adverse effects on the olfactory systems of the animals, and which impacts their ability to survive. But I was wondering if they're related and if ocean acidification also has an effect on the temperature and oxygen tolerance of these species as well.
Yeah, good question. I think you're not alone in thinking that the primary effect of climate on marine species will be through the acidification of their of water. I don't think that's true. I mean, I understand why people think that. The evidence for it is very murky, and I'll give you a couple of examples. One is the example from Earth history shows that people have argued that species that who are most susceptible to acidification went extinct at higher rates than those that were not. Although this is true, the increment of extra extinction risk is very small. And it's not really clear whether it was really associated with their susceptibility to acidification or with something else. Two, when we did these simulations for the Permian extinction, which was the extinction where people had argued that more acidity susceptible species went extinct more. What we found was that if you predict the extinction pattern across latitude from ocean acidification by itself, you would have found that the tropical species went extinct more frequently than the high latitude ones, which is exactly the opposite of what we observe. That doesn't mean that nothing went extinct because of acidification. It just means that that could not have been the dominant cause. So those are two counter arguments from Earth history perspective. I'll give you two counter arguments from a modern perspective. One is that ocean acidification, the decline of pH, is a change in the environment that species can typically compensate for by paying a small energetic cost. That is, acidification is about the acid-base balance of seawater, and species are used to regulating the acid-base balance of their internal fluids in order to compensate to some degree for changes in the acid-base balance of their ambient environment, as long as they have enough energy to do so. And it doesn't take a whole lot of energy to do that. So really, I think that there's a sort of fundamental reason why there will be an energetic cost, but it's a cost that can be paid. It's not like losing oxygen, where if there's not enough oxygen to breathe, there's nothing you can do as an animal to make oxygen. There's no way around it. If the pH goes down, you can pump protons to get rid of them. So there's a fundamental difference in the biochemical nature of a loss of oxygen from a decline of pH. And the second modern counter argument is that when you actually subject species to changes in declines in pH, you see responses that are all over the place. Some actually do better, some do worse. And there's just no, if you just look at species as a whole, there's just not a system-wide response to ocean acidification that you can really rely on to describe, whole ecosystem responses, which is not the case with oxygen, where things kind of all go in one direction because there's just no choice. So there's a few reasons why I think I don't want to say that I don't want to be construed as saying that ocean acidification is not important. I just think that it's been overemphasized in the way that the public understands why the oceans are at risk.
I had no idea about that. That was really interesting. Wow. Thank you for that response. I have one more last question before we wrap up. I read recently that kelp forests have major potential for reducing the temperature in the ocean and reducing the carbon dioxide, for sequestering carbon and then preventing the warming of the oceans. And I would like to know, in your professional opinion, if this strikes you as a realistic and pragmatic solution.
I don't know is the real answer. I know that people are thinking about this, and I think it's worth thinking about. I think kelp forests themselves, probably not, but a broader class of strategies that uses the growth of macroalgae, so things like kelp, seaweeds, could have some effect if it were done over a very large scale. My hunch is that it's gonna be, I mean, it's not gonna, I think that it's impossible for it to make a major dent in the net carbon balance to offset what we do with fossil fuels. But it's sort of one sliver of a bigger strategy, I guess.
Thank you.
With any of these things that relies on plants, right? Any strategy that relies on plants to take CO2 out of the atmosphere, which is what plants do, you always have to ask, okay, well, where they took the CO2 out of the atmosphere and they put it into the plant tissue, where does it go then? So that's the question you always have to ask. Because if it just gets eaten or respired or released back into the atmosphere, as most plant material does, it hasn't done anything on balance, right? It becomes just like growing a forest to burn it down. It doesn't have any long-term effect. It had a short-term effect, but in the long term, it doesn't.
Thank you. That was extremely, I learned a lot in this lecture. Thank you so much. We are gonna wrap it up now. Grace, I'm gonna share my screen and okay.
Okay, so just as we wrap up the Q&A, I'd like to really thank Professor Deutsch for giving us such an interesting lecture. I'd also like to thank everyone for coming and watching and engaging with the talk, your questions and comments. Before we conclude today's session, I wanted to end with a message of hope in the form of a very powerful quote. So it is better to light a candle than curse the darkness. The origin of the quote is unknown, but they have been attributed to numerous people, including Eleanor Roosevelt and Confucius. And along the same lines, the renowned conservationist and primatologist Jane Goodall once said, "If we all lose hope, there is no hope. Without hope, people fall into apathy. There is still a lot left that is still worth fighting for." And it's important to remind ourselves of how much all of us can still do for the planet. This lifts us out of apathy and inaction and stimulates the global collaborative effort we need in order to effectively combat climate change. And I'd also like to remind you all of the other lectures that we'll be hosting in the upcoming weeks. We hope you'll be able to join us for some of them. And this just shows our next one is Sea Level Rise on May 7th at 5. And just thank you for your time, everyone, and have a great evening.
Thanks. Bye.